Welcome and hello, everyone. We're going to get started in about 1 minute with the webinar. Well, welcome to today's webinar, Voice of the Online Learner from Wiley University Services. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Phil Hill. I'm an independent market analyst and a publisher of the On EdTech newsletter by Phil Hill and Associates. And I have to say, from a personal note, I'm thrilled that I was asked to moderate this panel. This is one of the surveys that comes out once a year that I really look forward to. I find that too often in higher education, we talk about students, but we too seldom actually hear directly from students. And this survey has been a long-running great way to hear direct input from students, what they think. Prospective, current, and recently graduated online students. So looking forward to the webinar. Before we get to it, I'd like to show a couple of housekeeping items. We, during the registration process, we did solicit some questions that people wanted to address, and that will be part of the basis of the discussion from the panel today. But also notice that the Q&A feature will allow you to do real-time questions. There might be some that we elevate and include into the conversation, or just might be able to address later. So if you want to add questions or post comments, use the Q&A feature. If you look at the handout section, you can access the slides that you're looking at right now, and you can access the actual Voice of the Online Learner 2023 report in the handout section. And by registering, a link to the recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone. So you will get a recording for this to view afterwards. So today I'm joined by a great panel, and we're going to be discussing not every single aspect of the survey, but trying to go into a little bit more depth and getting different perspectives reacting to the survey and the topics that it raises. So I'd like to have each of the panelists introduce themselves quickly so you understand where they're coming from in the context. David, we'll start with you.
Yeah, Phil, thanks for the introduction. Really appreciate the kind words there. I lead the team that writes this survey every year. Really proud of the work that my team does leaning into better understanding today's online learner. I work for Wiley University Services. We work with universities across the country and across the globe to help them execute on their mission, particularly around online learning. Jim?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for the invitation as well. And it's great working with you all. My name is Jim Fong, and I am the Chief Research Officer at UPCEA. And UPCEA is a nonprofit association in DC. It's over 100 years old, and we do a lot of leadership and market research and intelligence and lobbying for about 400 members. And we have all sorts of different conferences and programs to help leaders within this field develop and grow and staff and market and do all sorts of things like that. And my team does a lot of research, and we've worked together with David and the Wiley team on a number of initiatives. Prior to that, I was with Penn State University, and I helped in the early days of Penn State's World Campus. I was doing a lot of new program assessments. We had to boil down, basically, how do we get from 100 great ideas to our launching of our first 3 to 5 programs, and how do we replicate that every year, and also transforming a marketing team from a traditional kind of marketing group into a digital marketing group. So those are kind of my experiences. And again, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Jim. Raj?
Greetings. Thanks, Phil. My name is Raj Chambadi. I have the honor of serving as the president at Illinois Institute of Technology. We were founded in 1890 on a very noble vision to educate students from all walks of life. And for our work with college access and guaranteeing post-graduation outcomes, we were just named by Bloomberg Philanthropies as one of 28 high flyer institutions nationwide. In my prior avatar, when I was at the University of Illinois, I led the team that launched the first scaled online MBA program at the University of Illinois. It's called the IMBA and has been regarded as a breakthrough innovation of the past decades. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for this opportunity.
Well, great. Well, I'm looking forward to the discussion, and we are going to try to keep it interactive and, as opposed to full presentations, although we will start out with an overview. But with that, I'd like to talk about the agenda today. And essentially, the way to think of this is as the current landscape of online learning evolves post-pandemic, so do the attitudes and behaviors of online students. So today, we plan to explore the recent findings from the latest Voice of the Online Learner report, as well as getting actionable takeaways and recommendations that can apply to your institutions or relevant institutions' online programs and strategies. What we're going to start out with, so we're not just acting, from a blank slate, David's going to begin by talking us through the methodology and a preview of a lot of the findings. And then from there, we're going to pivot into a panel discussion between the four of us. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn it over to David to be able to present an overview of the findings. And I will say ahead of time, it's definitely worth reading the entire report, even the things that we don't end up covering on the webinar today. David?
Thanks for that, Phil. There's a ton of data in there. I'm going to try to give a good overview of basically what we did and some of the key findings. But yeah, I totally agree. A lot of really great insight in the report. It's worth reading. So what is this report is a good place for us to start. It's a survey of 2,600 folks that were US-based prospective students, current students, or recent graduates of online programs, right? So these are all folks that are making that decision in the next few months or have recently been in a program or graduating from a program. This is building on really over a decade of research that our team has been a part of. And so many of you may be familiar with formerly the Online College Student Survey, the Learning House surveys for about a decade. We've been doing this survey for about 3 years or so now. This is building on that question set, and we're really seeking to better understand today's adult education market, today's online learner. One call out I do have on the data that I think we're pretty proud of is that the National Center of Education Statistics estimates there's about 6 million online learners today, fully online learners. With a 95% confidence interval, we've only got something like a plus or minus 2% margin of error in this particular survey. And that leads me to where I want to start the conversation, and that's things that we've heard again and again from our students over the years. So like I mentioned before, building on a decade of this type of work, we're in a very mature marketplace at this point for online learning. And there's some things that we just know to be true at this point because we ask them so consistently. We've literally asked tens of thousands of students their preferences when it comes to modality. And a lot of them tell us modality comes first. I decided to go online before I decided anything else. They want to stay local. They want to pick schools that are close to them. Students are price sensitive, right? But they value quality. And we also know that they're often a career motivated type of learner, right? So that's often what they're looking for is skills and things along those lines, how to get further in their career. So with something like modality comes first, these are data now right from the report, some visualizations that you might see as you flip through the handout that again is available as a PDF in the handout section here. We asked students a pretty straightforward question. If the program you wanted wasn't available at the school that you wanted, what would you do? And for years now, roughly 2/3 of students say, I'm going to go somewhere else, right? So what that means is if your program, you have a desirable market program that isn't currently available in an online format, there's a good chance you're losing a lot of fans of your school. People that really want to go there are either going to choose to, some of them, they might choose to pick another program at your school. There's a small portion of them that may choose to just figure it out and go on campus. But the reality is the lion's share of them are going to choose to go somewhere else. We also find that when we ask students, what was the first thing you selected? Consistently, it's about 80% of students are telling us, I had to go online. Online was my first choice, then I figured it out from there. I mentioned this earlier, this idea of staying local. We've asked this question every year. There's a lot of interest in it, I think, all the time. A lot of us, when we start an online program, we're thinking, wow, we're truly global now. We're going to have a footprint that spans the globe. We're going to get students from all over. And the opportunity is there potentially, but the reality that we see, and we see this from a lot of our data, is that about half of your students are probably going to come from, let's call it driving distance, right? About 50 miles or fewer. This is pretty consistent over time. You know, it's fluctuated here or there. Before the pandemic, it was really starting to widen out a little bit. Post-pandemic, we're seeing a little bit of contraction. People are liking to pick schools that are closer to home. There's a lot going on here. Some of it's about the increased availability of online programs in the marketplace. Some of it is about affinity for certain brands or schools. But the fact remains that largely a lot of your students are going to come from your backyard, or are going to come from maybe, let's say, you know, the state, or maybe just the adjacent state. So these are a lot of things that, like I said, over time, we kind of see this again and again. We've reported on it again and again in our findings. What we wanted to do this year was challenge ourselves to think about some of the new things that we're seeing in the data, particularly post-COVID, and report on those. So today's focus areas are going to be the following. We're going to talk about folks that have dropped out of school and come back, right? So I think this is a really important segment out there, one that maybe is a little under-researched, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that here today. We're going to talk about some shifting attitudes in synchronous learning. We're going to talk about everybody's favorite topic, certificates, stackable credentials, skills-based learning, things along those lines. We've got some data points on that, some admissions roadblocks that students are reporting, and then a discussion around their price sensitivity. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be quickly reviewing our key findings, the ones that I just mentioned on the prior slide, showing you a data point about them, and then rushing to get to that rich conversation that we're hoping to have at the end with Raj and Jim. So the first place I want to start is this idea of online learning as a pathway for former stopouts to finish their degrees. This is so critical right now. In particular, we've lost something like 1.5 million students over the last few years based on what's been happening with COVID, you know, and a lot of folks just leaving their degrees. So there's this huge audience out there of likely bachelor completers, master's completers, things along those lines that are out there, and we have to think about how we're going to address that market. We asked a number of questions around this in the report. We found that 42% of students from our survey were actually folks that had dropped out or stopped out of a program before. Half of those students left after only 6 months in a degree. So it seems like there's early intervention strategies are going to be really important. Folks seem to be leaving only 1 or 2 semesters into a degree. There's a chance there to support those students. The interesting thing for us was to find that almost 3/4 of these folks that are stopouts that are now looking at online learning as an opportunity have done online learning before. A lot of us were concerned. We were thinking to ourselves, well, you know, maybe these folks won't want online learning. You know, maybe they had a bad experience with it. A lot of folks, particularly, you know, have experienced this like remote online teaching in the last few years. That was, you know, kind of a remote emergency situation. Maybe wasn't as rich as typical online learning can be. But we find that a lot of these folks are actually still interested in going online. Some interesting facts about them and profiling those students. They tend to really prefer the local schools. So I mentioned that roughly 50% earlier. They're actually a little bit beyond that. They definitely want schools that are close to home. They want shorter completion times. They're really interested in fast programs, which makes some sense, right? They also have different motivations. So a lot of our students we find are saying that it's career motivations. You know, they want to get ahead in their career, trying to get a promotion. This audience is a little bit different. They tend to talk about non-career related reasons, things that are more about, you know, it was a promise to myself. It was always a goal of mine, things along those lines. It's kind of a little bit more squishy in terms of their motivations, but you know, and some of them on the other side are being pushed to it for like an industry requirement. So they're being told at work they need to go back and finish up their degree. Moving into our next point here around synchronous learning, this was a really interesting finding that we had in the prior 2 years surveying students during COVID. It was really interesting for us to see these COVID motivated online students were a little more interested in synchronous learning than they had been in the past. Like I said, we've done this survey forever, and for years I've been recommending to schools, hey, you probably don't want to do a lot of synchronous learning because it's going to turn off a certain segment of the student population. A lot of the reason people are going online is because they want to manage their own schedule. So really stay away from that. but we're starting to see a bit of a pivot in the marketplace today. So like I mentioned, often when we think about ideal program design, these are the things I'm saying. Let's do fully online because 70% of students prefer that. 70% of students prefer asynchronous learning too. So these folks don't want to have to drive to campus once a week. They don't want to have to be logged on, at 7 o'clock every Thursday, those sorts of things. They're too busy for that. They want the option to take multiple classes at once and maybe accelerate their degree. They're really concerned, they're career motivated. So maybe they're trying to get through kind of quickly. And they're also really excited about adapting the degree to their needs, right? If they can bolt on a certificate, if they can choose their electives, they can choose a different pathway, they want to see that customization. But like I teased, and like I mentioned before, things are changing a little bit. And so we asked students more directly, hey, if there was synchronous learning, how would you feel about it? How often would you want to do it, right? How often would it be willing to log in at a specific time to join? And it's interesting. It's once a week is about half the audience. So there were a number of people that were from this group that said, I'd be willing to do it if I had to, right? What's interesting is there's a smaller group that's starting to say, well, maybe, once every other week or once a month or something along those lines, or even as little as once a course. So maybe an introductory session at the beginning, maybe there's, your final presentation, maybe that becomes live towards the end. With all these things, I think the option for students to attend these, making them optional or having multiple sessions available is going to be important. I will mention in the report too, we talk a little bit about the best time of the day, the time of the week, that sort of thing. So a little incentive there to get into the actual report. The next key finding here is going to be around certificates and micro-credentials, degree alternatives, these things that I think are front of mind for a lot of the folks that are likely on this call today. I'm going to start off with one data point that we had around just generally what's the interest level, right? And we can see pretty high interest levels from these students. More than half of them are extremely or very interested. About 3/4 of them showing some interest in doing things like completing a certificate for a new skill, maybe even stacking certificates, right? We see in the middle there, or completing a certificate that's a gateway into a degree. Some of these like MOOC to credit pathways and things like that we've seen in the market over the last few years. We're definitely seeing the students are saying these are things that we're interested in. What was interesting for us to do is to compare this data to another report, one that I recommend you go to our website and try to find. It's the Closing the Skills Gap report. And this is the one on the right that's highlighted in orange. What we did there is we surveyed over 600 HR professionals and asked them a battery of questions around how they're thinking about upskilling and reskilling their workforces. And it was really interesting for us to see that we've gotten to a point where a lot of these HR professionals, when it comes to validating a specific skill, actually prefer in some cases an industry certification over a college degree. Now I want to be really specific. This is for validating a skill. They're still very excited about hiring folks with college degrees, and the college degree shows them a more well-rounded candidate, and they showed a high preference for that. But when it comes to validating a specific skill, like let's say project management, they may prefer someone with like a PMP certification over someone that just has a bachelor's degree or a master's degree in project management. So an interesting trend that's happening there. The student side of the equation, we asked a similar set of questions around what types of things do you want to learn, and trade certificates, industry certifications, and all these things showed some interest from the student population. One more fact I'll mention here that's also in the report is a large number of students actually want to come back and learn from the same institution that they're currently at. So if you're thinking about these opportunities for students, these types of certificates, you've got this built-in market that has an affinity for you. It's your own students, right? And thinking about ways to engage with them throughout their career, I think is really going to be critical as we move forward, in the educational economy. Finding 4 of 5, we're almost at the end here. Online learners face admission roadblocks. And so we like to ask these questions. We think they're really important to highlight. Phil mentioned this earlier, that a lot of the time we're kind of guessing what students want. We're kind of using maybe intuitive design in a website, things along those lines, or kind of borrowing from other industries. But it really makes sense to ask directly to the students, what are your friction points? What were the things that frustrated you? What are you worried about? And there's some answers to those types of questions in the report. One on admissions process in particular, we saw some findings that are really surprising to us, kind of interesting to us because of how easy some of these things are to solve, right? Students are frustrated by having to gather all their transcripts, completing financial aid forms, just registering for courses. Some of these things that really should be pretty easy. And I think a lot of these students now are tech natives. They're folks that are used to using Amazon to make a purchase with one click, doing my taxes on TurboTax, and it really, takes me by the hand and leads me through it. And I think when we look at our own websites, for online learning, are they that, customer centric? Probably not, right? So really thinking about the user experience, putting yourself in the seat of the student, especially a student that's removed from your campus, how can we remove this friction? And there's some conversation about that in the report as well. Last key finding here is around students seeking more competitive pricing options. So I think we know, we've seen this trend for quite some time, that students are price sensitive, particularly the online marketplace, probably even more so than some of the traditional students that go right from high school, right? We've tracked this over time, and here you're looking at about a 5-year spread, and we're asking students, take a while to look at it here on the graph on the left, but the big thing that I see is when we ask these students about what degree they chose, is that gray bar at the bottom. So the folks that said, I picked the best school regardless of tuition, dropped quite a bit, right? Went from 23% down to about 16%. So this group that's willing to pay whatever, I just want the highest quality possible. I think a lot of us aspire to that. A lot of us want to say we're that person, but the reality is we're probably in the middle, right? We're probably more of the benefits oriented type of person that is going to pick a school that is maybe a little bit higher, but has the right format for me, or the right schedule, or the right location for me, or things along those lines. And that group grew from 28% to 35%. The group that said, the tuition for my preferred program was higher, but it was the content that I want, that grew a little bit, right, relative to the other folks. And so the people that are saying, I just want the cheapest program possible, roughly stayed about the same. We do say, a lot of students tell us directly that this is one of the most important factors in them selecting a degree. So last data point here around scholarships. So for years, we've reported on this fact too, that something as little as a $500 book scholarship historically has been able to move the needle for a number of schools. So you'll see this out there, whether it's a small book scholarship, maybe it's something like a piece of technology, like an iPad or a laptop or things along those lines. A lot of those have fallen out of favor a little bit. I think directly giving discounts and scholarship is going to be a little bit more of a motivator now for students than technology. But what we're seeing is that today it's going to have to be a lot more than $500, right? Something maybe around $1,000, maybe $1,500 is going to be more of a scholarship. We do see a lot more students too are reporting that they did get some sort of scholarship. This sort of couponing element, if we think about the behavioral economics of it, can be really motivating for folks. And so it's something that I wouldn't, kind of dismiss out of hand. I think this sort of strategy is something that can be really beneficial to make sure that you get a student connected with your program. So quick recap here, we talked a little bit about those learning pathways for the stop out, synchronous learning. We talked about certificates, a lot of topics for us to cover here, pricing, admissions roadblocks, things along those lines. We've got about half the presentation left now. I've got 1 or 2 more slides, and then I'm going to hand it over to Phil to walk us through a bit of a dialogue with our guests here today. So the last thing that I wanted to mention was in the report itself, if you flip towards the back, there's a series of questions and conversation prompts that are meant to get you started to think about some of these topics that we mentioned in the conversation today. Bring them back to your team, have a meeting about them, kind of use them as prompts in your weekly meetings. We recommend that. There's a lot of ideas in there that I think are going to start conversations that might lead to real change on your campus. So I really recommend looking at that actionable takeaway section. So I'm going to leave this on the screen for a little bit here. Feel free to take a screenshot. This is where you can reach out to all of our panelists. Again, I want to thank them for joining us here today. Jim, Raj, really appreciate it. Phil, thanks for guiding us through this. Next part in the conversation, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, David, and thanks for your entire team and the hard work you guys have done. So one thing I'd get started with, as an independent analyst, I love the longitudinal nature of this survey, that you can compare with past answers and the direct source from students, but seldom do I agree with the top line recordings as what the lead should be for a particular survey release. This year, it's different, to be quite honest. the nature of so many stop out online learners and this group and how much of this group is first generation students. Basically, it's just showing just how important online learning is as a method of expanding access. That doesn't mean it should be the only thing that people focus on or that all schools need to go online, but boy, if you really want to reach these first generation and these stop out students, you need to have an online strategy. So let me start out, and actually I'll start with Raj. In terms of, were you surprised by these numbers? A third of overall online students being first generation, more than 2 in 5 in the previous stop out group were first generation. Did this surprise you, and what does that mean for institutions?
Thank you, Phil. First of all, David, I want to congratulate you and your team for a very well done report. Phil, to answer your question, I was surprised because the conventional wisdom is that online learning tends to attract a different kind of an audience, if you will. And so the very fact that we have so many first generation students starting to think about online as a serious option is actually it's both heartwarming and causes concern for residential institutions, if you will. But I want to take it to a slightly higher level. And this comment of mine at a recent speech was not extraordinarily well received by fellow presidents, but this is what I said. I said restricting access for education to a select few that come on our campuses is by definition exclusionary. Mm-hmm. True inclusion means educating students anywhere, any place, anytime. And what this is telling me, and David, when I read your report and I start dissecting it, I realized that there are flexibility concerns for these first generation students. There are affordability concerns, and online seems to be a phenomenal way of enabling flexibility, potentially affordability, and last but not the least, enables people to fulfill their aspirations in a format and a schedule that is affordable to them. And that, to me, is good news for our society. And that also makes augurs, what this means is we as residential campuses should start thinking about digital learning in a different way, because it opens up newer segments. But more importantly, it also behooves us as residential institutions to start thinking about student experiences for these first generation students in a different way, so that we can not only fulfill their academic outcomes, but we can also focus on career outcomes, so that they can actually become productive citizens in the long run, if you will. So a lot of surprises for me, but also a lot of heartwarming and observations. So thank you.
Yeah. And Jim, from your member schools, but I know that you have a much broader perspective even than your member schools, but the same question were these findings surprising to you? What do you think it really means to higher education?
Well, as Raj mentioned here, being able to access students and to invite them in, and we're in such a different market than where we are 10, 20 years ago. The dynamic of students, the beliefs and the perceptions of students are so different here, and to have students that are experiencing college for the first time, that's a difficult thing to do. And if you look at the Gen Z learner too, and a lot of these individuals are obviously in that Gen Z category, they're very, very different from the 18 to 24-year-old or 18 to 21-year-old was 10, 20 years ago. There's a lot of different studies on basically that they struggle more as a result of from the pandemic with mental health issues, and they also want to establish a relationship. And for example, you just can't throw marketing there and call them up and get them to get on the phone here. you'll scare them away. That's where the whole ghosting thing came from. And so we've got to be real sensitive to their needs and build education and build engagements and strategies. So we invite them in, we have a dialogue with them, and we don't scare them away at this point. And higher education, we're in a stage of transformation here where it's all about come to our campus, come to our doors, and listen to us in our way. We will give you a tour and we will show you what we want to show you. That's going to change, especially with this online thing, and especially with what they see on our websites, what they see about us on social media, and whatsoever. And that's what, this will get folks in terms of that first generation student, but also that student that you mentioned, David, that left over the pandemic. It went from 36 million to 39 million, 39.1 million in a course of 3 years. And those students are disengaging for a certain reason. After 6 months, they feel like this is kind of weird for me, or I'm not getting a return on my investment. Why would I want to incur all that debt? So, we've got to find more inclusive ways, or ways that they can see value in the long run. And it's a very complicated equation.
Yeah, Bill, if I may add, sorry, David, if I may add one very quick thing. This also is positive for residential institutions. When you think about it, we have always thought of learners as a zero-sum game. We have 20 million college students in the United States. And if, I remember David's numbers, right? 40 million students who have some credit, no degree. 75 million high school students. 25 million community college students, out of whom only about 25% go on to transfer to college. So if you think about it, we are all focused on the 20 million, which is good. We need to educate them. There is huge non-consumption that is happening, which is what Jim pointed out just now. There is a reason why this non-consumption is there. And we need to start thinking about why this non-consumption of college degrees are happening, and devise strategies to attract them. But in the long run, I think this report is a very good reminder for us to be holistic in our strategy and not fixate on a very small segment. David, sorry to interrupt.
No, actually, that was really helpful, because it pulling a couple threads together from what you two just said. Raj, you mentioned, some of the thinking about these as one market, and Jim, you mentioned some of the mental health issues too. I think thinking about the services that we offer students is really important. And I know that one trend we saw during the pandemic that I think is like for the better is that a lot of our, kind of emotional health services, things along those lines, have moved online. This isn't a commercial for, BetterHelp and all these other guys that are out there, but I think we've all heard them on the podcast, the ads and stuff for them. And, a lot of schools have moved to using these types of services as well, which again, it has that benefit for the online learner, but it also probably has a big benefit for those Gen Z students as well. Thinking about digitizing some of these things, making some of these services remote accessible, benefits everybody.
Yeah, and sort of picking up on this holistic view about not segmenting, and online can benefit face-to-face and vice versa. I mean, it certainly seems to me, particularly from this survey, that online students, and I suspect the same is true, but to a lesser degree for on-campus and hybrid students, it gets to that administrative admissions process. So much of what we're dealing with is they need and want a much simpler process. And it was interesting to me, and the survey was talking about, well, what information are they seeking? What does it cost, and how long will it take? They're not asking for calculus answers here. They're not asking for the world. There's such a desire to make this simple and easy to get me the information I need. You could call it the Amazon experience in terms of researching, deciding, and sorry for being crass, but buying. How do you actually say, I'm going to get into this program? So how is that? You mentioned, David, in your part that these should be simple, but how is this impacting the landscape of higher education institutions? Do you see these problems getting solved, or is it going to get solved by current institutions, alternatives? So what's the future about making these decision-making processes easier for students?
I think the reality is that a lot of these are really easily addressable situations, but it takes investment, right? So I think there's off-the-shelf technology solutions. We offer some surprise, surprise, right? But we've done some things to invest in creating situations where you're really leading someone through their admissions process rather than expecting them to just do it on their own, right? I think about my own experience and having to go to multiple offices on campus and having to, physically mail checks and things like that, right? Decades ago. But today, we don't expect those things, right? It should be mouse clicks. And what we need to do is map out that student journey, think about those friction points, and then see where you can invest in solving them, right? And some of them are, there's full-blown kind of solutions for them, or even just small changes in policy can help make things easier for students. But I think it's really important, and it's something that for-profit schools are doing well. Alternative, kind of MOOC providers are doing well. The Googles and the Amazon Learning of the world make it really easy to sign up for their stuff. So I think the expectations being set out there.
Jim, do you see schools moving along, learning, getting pressured to make things simpler?
We have a long way to go, to be honest with you, Phil. We just did a study with another organization. We just looked at their websites. We secret shopped 100 institutions. We filled out forms, and we are still centered for the most part around ourselves, around our industry, and less. But a number of institutions are getting much, much better. I mean, I look at it, 10, 12, 15 years ago, we didn't have a lot of CRM systems. We were doing things and putting things on spreadsheets and databases. We've gotten better at managing the relationship. That relationship is really critical, and it's very scientific. You just cannot say, okay, as soon as that form is filled out, an email gets sent and you respond in a particular way. You've got to respond, fairly quickly, or they start shopping again. There's a whole science, that whole enrollment management. And what we found in a lot of research here is about half our institutions are probably doing it well and the other half are not. And, I secret shop, institutions, at least every month, and my team has done that. And, a recent study here is that, when we did all the search engine stuff, we found that 58% of institutions, actually the industry received a 58 score out of 100. Not good. But when I've done a lot of shopping, and when we've looked at our analysis, I had to fill out a form, a request for information form that had 27 required fields. You don't do that. Some of the research we've done is you ask for their first name, last name, email address. They're probably not going to give you their cell phone number right away. You can try to ask for it. And how did you hear about us? And then you build that relationship around them as you go. Otherwise, if you ask 27 questions, you're going to lose them. You're going to scare them. They're going to ghost you. And so, but we've got to re-examine the whole way of how we do things. I'll just kind of give up one last story. I went and left some information for one of the leading online providers out there. And for the next 3 weeks, I did not pick up my phone when it rang. I received about 7 or 8 emails over the next 2 weeks, but I received on average 3.5 phone calls a day. Now, I'm in my 50s. I'll tolerate that. I'm just watching the experiment happen. But if you do that to a Gen Zer, you have scared them. They are not going to respond to that. They think you're going to be trying to sell them something, harass them. It's just not a good formula. So we've got to be more strategic, deliberate, and planned in terms of how we react to this online learner, especially the young adult learner.
Yeah, it's so true. And you mentioned email, and now it's chat on site, text message, right? Responding on the social media site. Those sorts of things too are equally as important to that audience.
Yeah, my daughters won't even answer the phone for me, but I suspect that's a different issue. Let me bring in another one of your key findings, and again, where I'm surprised to find out how much I agree with the key findings this year. But I've reported the past couple of years the significance of synchronous and asynchronous findings, and particularly don't overinterpret the 71% prefer asynchronous, because two things: so many students are open to what I would call synchronous augmentation of these asynchronous courses. But at the same time, the greatest need, particularly for first generation students, is engagement. I need to talk to somebody to help the admissions process. I need to talk to my instructor, talk to my peers. So there's this hunger, a demand for engagement. And it's one of what I call the Achilles heel of online learning. Well, thanks to the pandemic, I think people realize now there are ways to increase engagement, and quite often using synchronous methods won't change the instruction necessarily, but it gives a way to improve engagement. So this nuance of these findings is very important in my opinion. Are we seeing, do you think we're seeing a fundamental shift in student preferences on modality? And it's sort of a leading question that we're partially addressing. Are institutions ready to take advantage of these pandemic accelerated changes? Are we seeing a fundamental change, and are institutions ready for it?
Yeah, I can take this, Phil, first. I will tell you one of the findings that surprised me was that students choose the mode first and the university later. I think this is phenomenal, and this is going to act as an accelerant for a lot of schools to go into digital learning. For far too long, we in the university space have said, if we build it, students will come. And now it is saying, no, there are alternatives, and modality comes first, and that was a great finding. But when it comes to the synchronicity versus asynchronous, to me, just like anything else, it behooves us as residential institutions not to design a one-size-fits-all pedagogy. Asynchronous is phenomenal, especially for students that have to work, adult learners that have scheduling concerns. Asynchronous education helps. But when you look at the report and it says local institutions matter, that a significant portion comes from within 50 miles, etc., the ability to have a master class, using synchronous learning once a quarter or something for these students, where there is some sort of a connection to the mothership. Maybe they can do it even on campus, if you will. Students have an option to connect with the institution, and as importantly, build belonging. One of the experiences that we have is when you build purely asynchronous, Phil, you talked about it, you alluded to the lack of social learning. And so to me, the synchronicity enables you to set up a larger framework, if you will, where students feel that they belong. But more importantly, when you marry it with social learning, have very active fora for students to interact and learn from each other, I think that is a winning recipe.
Yep.
Yep. The way I interpreted that question, I had to think hard a little bit in terms of the synchronous and asynchronous piece. And I think, Phil, you started kind of leading down the path of what's going on here. We just came through a pandemic. They just spent 3 or 4 years hanging out with their parents. I had my Gen Zer here for a few years, and now she's back again working remotely. These are things that happen where folks spend so much time online, on Zoom meetings, and in social media. And we know that young adults, young people, they use social media in a particular way. They're talking their computers just like we're doing it right now. And I think that's that desire to reconnect. And again, we talked about that with regarding mental health and other issues. They want to talk to a human being at some point, but they want to kind of do it on their terms. They want to be engaged in a particular way. They want it to be meaningful. So I think the whole modality here is one opportunity to re-engage and to see faces here. One of my analysts at UPCEA, she was thinking about going down to her graduation after she got her online MBA. But did the institution create enough value for her to do that? My daughter just got her master's degree at Rutgers online, but she wanted to experience that. I worked at Penn State, and I've taught there a little bit in that jump. Students come back for online students come back for alumni engagements here. They're taught, they want that type of engagement. And I think that's where these learners are very savvy, but they want to do it on their terms, in their way. And so that's where asynchronous works in terms of they want their flexibility, and synchronous works when they want to engage. And I think coming out of the pandemic, we want to engage more, but we want to do it in a safe and kind of centered way around ourselves. And so, selfishly put, I think that's what's going on there. That's the way I interpreted it.
Yeah, and part of the reason I was going down that path is part of my observation, it's cultural in nature, is during the pandemic, emergency remote teaching. And then there was a big groundswell of, hey, emergency remote teaching is not quality online instruction. And that was all well and good. But what it missed was it sort of assumed as soon as we can, let's reject what's happening during the pandemic. And you started people saying, we know how to do online, it's asynchronous. Let's go back to what the professionals know how to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's blinded people to the hunger for engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also sort of pushing people too often to say, let's do things the way we've defined them in the past, as opposed to let's improve. We need to learn from here. So I think that part of this is cultural activities that sort of push us back to 2019, as if that was the epitome of online learning, which it wasn't. We always need to improve. And the pandemic has changed things, so we need to adapt as well.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I think like definitely what we're not advocating for is webcam in the back of the classroom, right? Like I think that we've seen some of these sorts of things out there, and I just loved what Jim was saying about that element of connection. We actually see from a lot of our survey data that your students in online programs are going to want to go back and experience graduation. They're also going to donate. They're going to come to campus, right? We get a lot of data in the report around they want to come to campus. They want to go to the bookstore. They want to go to the basketball game. They want to get a student ID. Like they are your students, right? And it's not as transactional as I think a lot of us maybe historically have thought about it. And I think that comes right down to how they want to engage with your professors and other students in that community of inquiry that Raj mentioned as well.
Yeah, and I'd like to go back to an area Jim introduced it, but we're talking about Gen Z, but really the students are different. And I don't want to imply that all people of a certain age group are similar, but there are big trends we need to pay attention to. And I say this as somebody, when you talk about a natural mobile device for consuming content and interacting, I'd say, well, that's my 13-inch laptop. So I get that I have a different perspective than younger students. But let's look at sort of the Gen Z students, ages 18 through 26 in they're in higher education and increasingly will be an important factor. What are the trends? Like Jim, you talked about social interactions. What are some of the other trends we see from this group that institutions need to be aware of, how to engage with them, what they need? We've mentioned some other aspects. So what are the big trends around this rising generation?
Well, one of the things we've obviously talked about, first of all, we don't want to scare them away. We want to engage them because they're very smart. They're very value conscious. They understand money. They understand data. We don't give them enough credit, for one thing. And they're just a very powerful group here. And I think we'll see that politically in the upcoming years as well. They care about the environment, and they're just a very amazing group. However, with that being said, here is there. David was saying something about those with some college no degree, and also those that have left college. And some of these folks are in that Gen Z kind of category. And when we talk about online, I want to say that we're not just talking about online credit, and online degrees. To get a lot of this Gen Z back, and also millennials and Gen Xers and career changers that are boomers that are kind of looking at different elements of our future economy. You were mentioning, you showed one of your slides earlier, David, is that the whole stackability element is going to be so important. We designed an educational system that was 120 credits based, and where we commanded a certain price on it and we guaranteed employment. Now we're actually at a situation here where we can't necessarily guarantee employment because our economy is going to a more automated AI type of economy there, and a data-driven economy. And so we're not necessarily saying 120 credits is going to do that. But in order to get this Gen Z to believe in us and trust in us, and that's such an important point, is they've got to sample us. And they've also got to take their learned experiences and make them meaningful into the future. And that's where the whole badges, that's all the whole certificate. They want a stackable credential here, and we knew that when they were little kids. We were giving them trophies and badges and certificates And they've come to expect that. And then all of a sudden we say 120 credits or nothing. You are not smart unless you get 120 credits, and therefore you cannot go on. So I think that's something where I believe that the future of education will change as, you know, millennials are making the power decisions right now, and Gen Z is a very powerful. I think this group is going to start transforming education sooner than later.
And Raj, I would imagine you've longitudinally seen a lot of this. You're, you know,
Yes.
with the IMBA and expanded access, but that was I think 2015 it was started.
Right.
But what have you seen changing over that period? What have you learned about the newer generations and how they're impacting colleges?
Right. So, like Jim said, with respect to Gen Z, they are much more in tune with the stackability and how these smaller credentials stack onto bigger and better credentials, including degree. I'll make two observations, Phil, and this was talked about by both David and Jim earlier. One, pre-collegiate experiences are becoming extraordinarily important. Gone are the days when a student can be a junior in high school, you send out a mailer and they come for a campus visit and so on. The value proposition needs to be communicated much earlier, and more importantly, how it benefits them has to be extraordinarily clear. You know, they are willing to sample. For example, we started virtual internships for high schoolers based on some surveys that we did, because people wanted to know, if I'm going to be a data scientist and I'm going to do a lot of data visualization, I need to understand what that means. So they are very different from the previous generations, if you will. Pre-collegiate experiences, how you treat them, not making the whole application process cumbersome. This generation is very different from the previous generation. And the second point that I will say is, at least since I oversee a technological university, Phil, we are seeing many more questions from our students, from our Gen Z students or prospects asking, okay, you're providing this education. Tell me how you would connect this to these career outcomes for me. They want a tighter fit between the education and career outcomes. So what are you going to do in terms of experiential learning opportunities? So you cannot guarantee me jobs, but can you guarantee job readiness? These questions are becoming much more explicit with Gen Z compared to the previous generations that we have seen. So I would say one word: pragmatic.
Mm-hmm.
Pragmatic, yeah.
I'll say one kind of like disheartening data point from the report that we had a lot of internal conversation around, where what does this mean? What's the impact of it? But we ask folks, do you believe your degree is important to achieving your career goals? And 80% of them say yes, right? Of course they do, because they're bought into going to school. That's the people that we're interviewing, right? Like, it makes sense. Gen Z, it was closer to half. It was maybe 55%. So they just feel like the bachelor's degree isn't going to get them as far, and they're probably right? Like, it's probably not. It's probably going to be more. It's probably going to be a bachelor's degree plus an industry credential, plus some certification, plus a lot of experience to really get them where they need to go. And so I think, I don't know how much they're disheartened or if they're just realistic, right? And they understand that they're going to have to do a little bit more.
If I made, add to David's point, brilliant point, David. We did actually change something because of this. There was a recent Wall Street Journal article study that said 56% of parents and students don't see value in higher ed and so on. So this is in that same strain. But about 2 years ago, when we were doing a survey, we realized that students, or at least Gen Z students, wanted connections to the industry. So we actually created career pathway courses inside campus, where students could take an industry credentials and wrap it around academic credit. So our online programming now accommodates industry embedded credentials. And this was a direct offshoot of what Gen Zers were demanding from us, in terms of saying, hey, wait a minute, there is this artificial silo, dichotomy between university education and industry credentials. Why can't the two meet? So they are doing a lot of good things, and Jim said this. I think they are going to change, education in the future, because they are much more pragmatic, and they are making us think and make hard choices in terms of what education should be.
Yeah, and I think there's a risk with the sort of binary discussion we have: is college worth it? But a lot of the findings here, it's absolutely a key data point. Even we can't end on a negative data point, David, but the point that you made about 50% of Gen Zers don't see that value, I interpret that somewhat, combining with other results, saying they don't see the value as traditionally defined. Like the potential's there, connecting it to workforce needs, giving us more flexibility, stackability. So it's not that there's no value in education or that there can't be. It's if higher education rests on its laurels and doesn't advance, then we got a real problem. But there's a lot of data, including what's in the report, to say there's a real potential to connect with students, Gen Z and beyond, with much better offerings, and they're showing a hunger for it. We have just quick 2 minutes left, but what I'd like to do, go ahead.
I was going to say, I've got a data point for you, though, real quick, because I think you just said one that is probably a little bit rosier to end on. So we asked folks that have recently graduated. See, these are people that have graduated only within the last 12 months, right, from their online programs. 90% of them reported that they had a positive career outcome already, right? Half of them had already gotten a salary increase. A third of them had increased their confidence. So there was some real tangible and some of the more intangible things that we were seeing. It's page 16. Please go review that. There's definitely some positive stuff in there as well.
Sure. So, and I would combine that with the first thing we talked about, the fact that expanding access, stop outs, first generation students. And when you go online, a lot of the students going online are saying, I'm seeing benefits. We need to connect. We need to make that easier for them to access, and we need to improve it. So overall, let me just give a minute for each of you. If you could just say, what is, your number one takeaway from the survey moving forward? So in a minute or less, and we'll start with David.
Yeah, so I think, you hit the nail on the head, Phil. Education itself is such an opportunity for transformative change, right, for folks. And I think it's so important. But the reality is that a lot of people can't do it in those old traditional models, right? They need this online model. They need that access. This is the only way they're going to be able to do it. So I think institutions investing in this is going to be really critically important for changing our socioeconomic climate.
Great, thank you, Jim.
I think that given the complexity of the learner, that you just can't have that degree as being the only thing. And so you've got to build certificates, you've got to build that stackability, you've got to build non-credit credit pathways, and you've got to build digital badges and certificates as this portfolio, not just a program. In my Penn State days, we tested, okay, what's an online MBA going to get us? You've got to build out the whole business portfolio. Otherwise you might not want to be in that business. So you can't build an island. You've got to build out pieces of so different people can jump in. So alumni can jump in. So people with a high school a degree only can jump in for non-credit education. If you're good at computer science or business logistics or gaming or whatever, they need to grab that piece and then apply it to it's a currency. It's a piece of educational money that they can apply later on to get something bigger. I kind of feel like it's almost like a carnival game where you trade up for the prize. But you've got to be thinking about that, because 120 credits is a bridge too far for a lot of folks, especially if we're talking about inclusion and building out for a wider range of society.
Great, thank you. And Rod?
As an institution that prides itself on measuring ourselves by how many people we include, there were two things that the report opened my eyes to. One, there was a slide on openness to degree alternatives from an employer point of view. And I think if I remember right, David, more than half of the employers said industry certification was a credential that they valued more than a bachelor's degree or something. To me, that tells me that as a residential institution, we need to interface, co-create with our employers, and start thinking about how do we embed those credentials into our traditional educational offerings, if you will. So that is point number one. Point number two is, given the importance of the digital mode, and given that over 1/3 of our digital students are first generation students, or over 1/3 of the first generation students embrace digital, to me it is important for residential institutions to have a digital layer, because that is going to be fairly important. Just like it was e-commerce 20 years ago, now it is commerce. I think digital layering is going to be fairly important in this artificial dichotomy between a residential campus and an e-campus. I think they are going to diminish in the long run. So in the short run. So to me, having a digital layer so we can be truly inclusive to all audiences is another lesson that I took away from this report.
Okay. Well, thank you. I want to thank all three of our panelists, Raj, Jim, and David, for an excellent conversation going into more depth on the subjects. I want to thank David and his team, the full team, for putting out the report, and remind people there's a lot of resources available. Please download the full report and see additional findings, additional recommendations. And as I said, you will be getting a link for the recording of this webinar. So I want to thank everybody for your participation, and look forward to next year.
This was great. Thank you. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.